All right. Welcome back, everyone. Now, I'm honored to introduce you to our second keynote speaker for the day, Mr. Joe Bhatia, CEO of the American National Standards Institute, or Ansi. As many of you are aware, Ansi plays a unique role as leader of the American National Standards Program. Ansi promotes the use of U.S. standards internationally, advocates U.S. policy and technical positions in international and regional standards organizations, and encourages the adoption of international standards as national standards where they meet the needs of the user community. Ansi is the sole U.S. representative and dues-paying member of the two major non-treaty international standards organizations, ISO, or International Organization for Standardization, which we were just speaking of, and the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, via the U.S. National Committee. In addition to Mr. Bhatia's numerous leadership positions in domestic and global forums, he is a frequent lecturer in the U.S. and around the world on topics such as international trade, technical developments, commercial market access, and health, safety, and environmental concerns. Today, he will deliver the second keynote address entitled Standardization, a Driver of Innovation in U.S. Competitiveness. Mr. Bhatia, mic is yours.
Thank you very much. Very interesting dialogue I heard for all the time I was here. Sounds familiar. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be with you. My comments today will be presented in three different segments. I wanted to give you the setup. First segment would be an overview of ANSI and the importance of standardization. That's what we want to talk about. Second would be a discussion of how ANSI's collaboratives advance the U.S. leadership in critical technologies. And lastly, we'll talk about a subject that everybody's interested in, China's involvement in standardization activities internationally, and how that impacts U.S. and our activities. But as far as ANSI is concerned, for more than 100 years, we've been privileged and proud to present, if you will, the role of U.S. private sector-led standardization system, facilitating solutions that have powerful real-world impact and that address the most pressing and most critical issues facing U.S. and the world. Increasingly, the leaders of the government and industry are now beginning to recognize more the power of standardization and its essential link with the U.S. technological leadership around the globe. And indeed, among this COVID activity and its attendant societal and economic challenges, standardization perhaps becomes even more crucial today than it's ever been before. Supporting public health, supporting safety and infrastructure, serving as an essential catalyst for technological breakthroughs, not just in COVID areas, but every area, economic activity, very essential area, and international trade, which helps us survive or not effectively in global markets. So it's a great pleasure to join you because I've been listening and reading about an audience that is clearly seeing the importance of standardization to the DoD mission. Curiously, even though standardization is at play everywhere, every day, many people don't have too much of an idea or very little idea of its impact on nearly every aspect of everyone's life. The fact is, standardizations and standards make everyday life work. From the air we breathe in, to the food we eat, to the technologies that support our remote working, for example, like this virtual conference. I hope it's working because otherwise we won't be able to continue. So standardization is at play, ensuring safety, quality, and interoperability, along with other benefits for all of us. Now, to be clear, when I talk about standardization, I'm talking about standards and compliance to them. Most of the people miss that second part of the puzzle, which is sometimes overlooked. But without this mechanism to assure that products and processes and systems and even personnel actually conform to the established requirements, standards are just nothing but a good idea without any material impact. And consider this, a staggering 93% of the global trade, global goods exported and imported, rely on conformance to standards, not just the standards. And this is according to our own Department of Commerce. So it's helpful to think that standards and conformity assessment, quite frankly, are two sides of the same coin. Together, they bring together the currency to the power of standardization in totality, protecting health, protecting safety of citizens, driving new and emerging technologies, facilitating trade. Bottom line is that standardization is at the heart of U.S. competitiveness, prosperity, and quality of life. And the breadth of standards activity in U.S. is huge. There are more than 100,000 standards in the U.S. developed by 500 standards developing organizations, or SDOs, as we call them, and hundreds of consortia on top of that. Out of these SDOs, more than 240, and that's a large number. Most countries have only a handful. More than 240 are accredited and accepted by Ansi. More than 13,000 of the standards that are approved by these standards are approved by Ansi as American National Standards, which is our most highly evaluated designation. So these standards span nearly any industry sector you can imagine, from healthcare and financial services to information, communication technologies, and beyond. Ansi safeguards also the integrity of this vast standardization system, which by design is based on what? Us being together, me and you guys, private and public partnership. It's driven by the needs of the market, and it's driven by the public interest and by the demands and needs of federal agencies. For more than a century, Ansi has provided a neutral forum for all the affected parties, including industry, government, academia, consumers, others, you name it, to work together on standards-based solutions to address the national and global concerns. Through our network of members and all the engagement that we have in Ansi, we represent the interests of more than 270,000 companies and organizations and about 30 million professionals worldwide. Most of them are in the US, but there are many outside as well. Ansi also speaks as the US voice in international standardization, serving as the official representative, as you just heard, of the US national standards bodies, ISO, IEC, US National Committee to the IEC through our US Ansi activity, and also representing us in the regional activities and in many segments of the world, and coordinating the US policy and technical input into these two largest and most recognized standards developing organizations in the world, but also at the regional level in the regional standardization activities. Through the work of Ansi, our members, the US currently participates in more than 94%, that's a lot of percentage, of the entire IEC technical activity, and nearly 80% of all the ISO technical activity, which is very diverse and very large. So US competitiveness in the global economy is closely related to our relationship and leadership and influence in the development and use of the standards and conformity assessment activities, both domestically and internationally. So a collaborative system with broad expert engagement from both the public and private sectors has tremendous impact on our nation's strength, our nation's safety and prosperity. And indeed, one of the great strengths of the US system, which makes us unique among most nations, is our public-private partnership. We call it PPP. I love that acronym. Here in the US, our system is bottoms up, meaning that it's a private sector-led and market sector-driven while benefiting from the active engagement and guidance of the government participation. By comparison, and I think you know this, most other countries and economies are a top-down system. Even in Europe, which is quite widespread and quite private sector engaged, still, the mission dominates the direction of where things go. This is more likely to miss if you're top-down. Inputs from key constituencies such as the user community, the consumers, or even the industry sometimes. They're completely overlooked in many countries, many times, on many crucial issues. We don't have that problem. The US approach maximizes the opportunities for innovation and growth and benefits from the involvement of all affected stakeholders, making it dynamic and quickly responsive system to rapidly changing market needs. And you know these things are changing very rapidly, especially now in the last many years. The core characteristics of the US system are spelled out in the United States Standard Strategy. And this year, like we do every 5 years, we're updating the process, we're updating the document. Ansi has been leading a complete review and update of this guiding document used by both the public and private sector. We're working to assure that it continues to meet the needs of the diverse US interests and that it reflects the national and international priorities, the technological advances, the industry growth areas, the relevant US government policy updates. We want to make sure we take care of all of those things. So when it comes out, broad stakeholder input has been a central focus of the revision process. You'll see just about everything that we have revised has been suggested by a robust public and government agency comment period that has gathered for us a very thoughtful input which has been embedded in the changes. This feedback will help assure a strategy that will effectively guide how the US develops standards and participates in the international standard setting process as well for many years to come. So this revised standard strategy is expected to be approved by the Ansi board at our December meeting, which is coming up in a couple of months, and published early 2021. The strategy is then usually embraced and endorsed by private sector. They write testimonials, they embrace it, they practice it, they use it, and the government agency, including Department of Defense, does it many times. So with that, let me move on to the second subject, and that is Ansi collaboratives, which advance US leadership in critical technologies and other needy areas. As I see it, one of our most crucial roles is to foster dialogue and cooperation between the public and private sectors, leveraging their collective input and expertise to advance emerging technologies and the areas of our national and global priorities. So for the last 20 years, though, Ansi has convened a cross-sector level of groups known as Ansi Standardization Collaboratives to address important areas such as homeland security, right after the 9/11 attack, that was how it was formed, health, IT, unmanned aircraft systems, we talk about aircraft systems, space, additive manufacturing, nanotechnology, that's been expanding and becoming more impactful for at least 2 decades. And these are just few examples. There's much, much more. Often these collaboratives are launched by calls from the government agencies, from industry, or from both. And Ansi collaboratives play an important role in positioning the US for leadership in critical emerging technology areas and in international activities as well. Just this past June, Ansi's Unmanned Aircraft Systems Standardization Collaborative, that's a mouthful, otherwise known as UASSC, published version 2 of its standardization roadmap to facilitate the safe and effective integration of drones into the national airspace. Developed by 400 individuals representing 250 cross-sector organizations and institutions, the roadmap builds upon the USSSC's 2018 standardization roadmap, that was version 1, and it has been 2 years, so a lot has gone on, and we have developed a lot of new information. For example, it cites 71 standardization gaps where we have needs but not the solutions yet. Associated recommendations come along with that, and the timelines to advance the growth of the US market is the goal. Given the growing interest in the drones industry, it is not surprising that the roadmap has already been downloaded by nearly 900 times. That usually means 900 different companies and institutions are looking at what we're trying to tell them. To be sure, the drones market is an important one, projected to grow to more than $123 billion by 2025. As you know, drones have many important applications these days, and you look at what's going on in California, from firefighting to sky-based monitoring, to rescue facilitation, to military applications, and much, much more. But the safety is critical. People's privacy is also an issue, and that's where standards and conformance and roadmap come into play. We look at every aspect of the activity, not just the launch of a product or a system. While USSC effort is largely focused on commercial and civil and public safety issues of drones, it's also of interest to DoD and the defense community. Earlier this year, Ansi participated along with SDOs, DoD, and defense agencies at a NATO workshop in Athens that drew participation from 26 countries. That event focused on bridging the gap between NATO's use of military specifications and the SDO civil standards, the private sector standards. Ansi highlighted the USSC as a case study where the SDOs are considering the application of NATO standards in a civil context, and conversely, where NATO can potentially consider the use of private sector standards to meet its needs. And we're working separately on this initiative just as we speak. We are thrilled to see the roadmap widely recognized by industry and government as being a vital, important issue to enabling rapidly evolving capability of unmanned aircraft systems or drones. Another complex and growing technology that I'm sure you're all familiar with by now is additive manufacturing or 3D printing. Now, to accelerate the development of standardization solutions in this space, Ansi partnered with America Makes to administer a collaborative that brought together more than 300 subject matter experts, many from the aerospace, defense, and medical sectors, to produce 2 versions of the standardization roadmap. Additive manufacturing technologies are of vital importance to DoD and other agencies, as well as the American industry, as they help to do a bunch of things. They restore damaged parts to their original condition or better. They allow parts to be made quickly in low quantities, even in the field. And they lower the procurement cost for components and, of course, create a lesser financial burden for everybody involved. As such, DoD has been very supportive of this collaborative since its launch, providing significant funding, playing an active role in the roadmap's development, and servicing, if you will, in the roles of leadership in the advisory group, which was engaged by Greg Saunders of DoD. I think a lot of you know him. He used to be a board member of Ansi. He's now semi-retired. Also, co-chairing occurs from alongside of Greg. Additional representation from Army and Air Force research laboratories. We greatly appreciate DoD's active support and involvement in this activity. Without that, it wouldn't have been moving as fast and as nicely as it has. So this particular AMSC roadmap has also been very well received by the industry. The version 2 has been downloaded more than 3,000 times. So you can see it has been there for a while. It's been getting used more and more. We are now monitoring the progress by the standardization community to address 93 standards gaps that have been recently, in recent times, identified. So work continues there. As part of Ansi's ongoing efforts to enhance U.S. competitiveness home and abroad, Ansi continues to assess the need for the standardization activities in rapidly expanding growth areas. As artificial intelligence, or AI, makes its way into more and more aspects of our lives, it is also finding growing application in healthcare. According to the World Economic Forum, over the next 10 years, AI will assume even a more prominent role in predictive care, in networked hospitals, and in improved efficiencies for patients, hospitals, and health systems. So to explore these opportunities for progress, Ansi convened a virtual workshop last month. We could only do it virtually, to identify challenges, barriers, and gaps, and to discuss steps to optimize regulatory frameworks. The workshop examined issues surrounding data, transparency and explainability, and governance and risk management. Looking ahead, we're now planning a workshop in 2021. Hopefully, we could do a face-to-face by then and make it more robust. And the purpose will be to develop recommendations for the coordination of standardization and governance to meet expectations of safety, quality, responsibility, and something we all care about, the risk. Another good example out there is 5G. Now let's go back to the days of automobile, the days of internet, electricity before that. 5G technology is poised to dramatically change the world in the same way, enabling new capabilities in healthcare, energy, transportation, manufacturing, and many, many, many other sectors. Vertical sectors, about 136 of them in this country, will probably all be affected. This is a hugely important technology area at the intersection of national competitiveness, security, and economic interest. So Ansi is working closely with our members in 3 critical areas, leveraging their collective interest to shape the strategy called for in 2020 Secure 5G and Beyond Act, launched by President Trump, and its related implementation plan, and advocating for greater interagency coordination and enhanced partnership between the public and private sectors in standardization area. And finally, working together with NIST, Ansi, NIST obviously is National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the Department of Commerce. We are seeking a public-private sector agreement and alignment on strategic U.S. approach to 5G standardization. All the major ICT industry associations are engaged. We're taking that lead in the private sector along with other private sector participants, and NIST is coordinating the public sector input. So hopefully we'll have a solution and a report coming out relatively soon. So with that, I'll take a sip of water, and begin our third and last section. That is China's involvement in international standard setting. This area brings a lot of excitement to any discussion. To be sure, just thinking broadly, U.S. participation in international standardization, especially in the areas of emerging technologies, is really critical to our nation's competitiveness. And that is critical for our commercial and business success also. So when Ansi, US companies, and the STOs in which they participate engage in international standard setting activity, we're talking about a tag to ISO. Now we have hundreds of tags that we oversee, as you know, both in ISO and IEC. And the STOs in which they participate all participate from their perspectives, and their contributions are significant. But US can continue to influence, define, and create and sustain our global leadership in the next wave of technologies like we have it right now that will impact our lives for years to come. A significant portion of America's economic growth comes from industries that did not exist 20 years ago. Just think about it. What didn't we have 20 years ago? A lot of things that we take for granted now. So as industries, manufacturing processes continue to evolve, they also offer tremendous promise for job creation and market expansion. So those are commercial benefits that our country can certainly use. But their success depends on continued innovation, and innovation, of course, relies upon standardization, which also facilitates scaled commercial application and mass adoption and use of the solution, and creates an ecosystem for competitive solutions to global markets as well. So today, the broad commercialization and deployment of critically important and cutting-edge technologies such as 5G, AI, Internet of Things, hinges on standardization. And indeed, nations around the globe are locking their sights on this major opportunity and try to become major players in the game, at least the large ones. So China is obviously the largest of the large and has signaled its interest in assuming greater leadership in standardization and in key technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and 5G, as noted in their Standards China 2030 plan, which is expected to be released later this year. Recent headlines suggest that anticipation is building among industry and government stakeholders about what the 15-year plan could mean for the US, how it might shape the standardization and technological landscape of the future, how it may impact us, and how, maybe, it may impact our leadership position that we have enjoyed for many, many years. Well, there's no doubt that China has steadily increased its engagement and influence in global standard setting. But in fact, it has been working for a long time. They've had priorities after priorities coming. They have 5-year plans for the last 15, 20 years, all focusing on this theme. Clearly, China recognized that standards are a critical tool to global commercial success. They are rapidly developing knowledge, skills, and sophistication in international standards organizations and working in ISO, IEC, and ITUT, and many times seeking to assume and are assuming more leadership roles within them. Generally speaking, this is a positive development if and only if everyone follows internationally established protocols and operates in accordance with the principles that we have all embraced. Principles and mandates that are outlined in the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, to which China is also a signatory. And it doesn't change the fact that US leadership remains very strong in the International Standards Organization. First, it's important to dispel the notion that holding technical leadership position, any international organization can take national standards body to skew the results in their favor. That just doesn't happen. The checks and balances embedded within the system prevent that from happening. Approvals come through a committee process in which many countries participate. And US, being one of the permanent members of both ISO and IC, has a permanent seat on the boards of both organizations and in the TMB, which is a technical management board overseeing all the standardization activity. So we are looking at everything that goes through. So that happens also from many other perspectives. So the balance is there. So reason leadership roles are important, and why Ansi is so proud for our focused leadership engagement and our connectivity to top-level leadership of both ISO and IEC, and naming people that we think are US favoring is also another challenge that we work very hard on and succeed in. It allows us to ensure that the integrity of the standardization process, assuring a level playing field, that participation is open, that everyone has the right to participate and be heard, but the best solution should prevail. And usually we lead in that regard. That's where success comes in. After all, it's the output of the process. Standards at their level have to be globally relevant. That's most important. That doesn't mean we'll win every argument. because the numbers sometimes, push us back in some areas. But regardless, we try to get the best standards out there. That's why everyone, including China, needs to be at the table, because if the big players are not aligned, we can have duplicative, repetitive, and redundant solutions that can take multiple efforts and cost a lot of money to the industry and to the government. So when it comes to standardization, it's important to lead with technical cooperation and consensus. And standardization is a long game. It really is. Administrations change, policies shift, but standardization endures and evolves. It continues to move on, and sometimes takes too long to develop a standard, but it does happen. So in the current environment, Ansi's role and the role of standards becomes even more important, ensuring a dialogue between the experts in both countries. As private sector organization, we have some advantages. Ansi can often approach our counterparts in China and even people in the government leadership of China and in other nations in a less highly charged platform, not politically motivated by standardization and technology and standards needs, providing a conduit for industry and other stakeholder views to be shared. On many fronts, Ansi works with the US stakeholders and Chinese counterparts to encourage their participation in the development of standards based on globally accepted WTO principles. This in turn will lead to continued development of high quality competitive products and services that benefit the global market. I think if we have a fair global market, we do quite well. As the representatives of ISO and IEC, we regularly engage China through these international channels, which often numerous opportunities are provided through, and promote US-China cooperation in standardization and advancement of right solutions. More directly, since 1980, Ansi's had a cooperative agreement with the Standardization Administration of China, SAC, which is a central government agency and is their national standards body, just like we are of the US. For the past 5 years, I have also served as a very privileged assignment, a designated foreign advisor role. There are only 7 of us in the world, chosen by the Chinese leadership, the top leadership, as a China Standardization Expert Committee of Foreign Input. This role affords us direct opportunity to influence decision makers in China at the highest level and to encourage China's embrace and application of international best practices and WTO protocols, which is a very big thing. I have also made it my own priority to work closely with the US industry and stakeholders, along with our Ansi team, to identify and address our priority sectors, issues of interest such as conformity assessment, which is a very critical issue these days globally, medical products, automotive research, and other important industries. And these issues change over time, so we have to be on top of that. Ansi has also run a dedicated China's program since 2006, closely monitoring the key developments and sharing the information with the US industry and US stakeholders about the rollout of the China standardization reform and the steps that are being taken, and commenting along the way how they can be improved to the degree that also satisfies our needs. Additionally, we organize trade missions to China, develop solution-driven industry webinars, and publish quarterly newsletters to provide insights both to our industry and our constituency that operate in China or are projecting or hoping to do that someday. And in other very important activity, Ansi coordinates industry workshops under a USTDA-funded program that enables US and Chinese industry and government representatives to cooperate and engage in constructive dialogue on all types of standardization issues. To date, we have completed 49 workshops covering wide range areas, including green building, medical technology, cold chain supply, and many, many more. So in many ways, China's efforts to increase alignment between domestic and international standards can be seen as a beneficial for foreign companies as it increases predictability for their supply chains. US manufacturers and many others in other countries can now better understand and have the visibility on what will be required for them to be able to sell in the Chinese market, which is often challenging. And in this way, they can more reliably plan for their future successes, hopefully. To be fair, there are also developments which are not always positive, that have represented a shift from previous structures of China's standardization system or shift from the global norms. These include things like promotion of new categories of standards, such as enterprise standards, which have been a very, very tough thing for US industry to deal with and accept. and social organization standards. Since these categories don't exist in the US and most other systems and most other countries, they can pose challenges for US companies, including increased manufacturing costs and market access problems. In these cases, it's extremely important for Ansi and the US community as a whole, including the private sector and the government sector, to be active and vocal with Chinese authorities on the negative impact of the divergent standards and the requirements that are not compliant, to WTO principles, for example. Ultimately, we believe the best approach is to encourage China's constructive participation in international standard setting and reliance on globally accepted principles described within the WTO-TBT agreement. After all, standards processes that are open, that are balanced, that are transparent, and that are based on consensus are less susceptible to being politicized. They're also more likely to produce standards that can be applied globally, facilitate fair international trade, and will be adopted by major developed economies like us. The more countries value the integrity of standards process as outlined in WTO principles and agree that these common solutions are less likely to see what is seen as undue dominance or unfair advantage in the international process, and we're less likely to see standards emerging that are not technically sound. And that is asking for something really special. Thank you all for your attention. On behalf of Ansi, I would like to thank DoD and Greg Saunders. He encouraged me to share Ansi's perspective on these very important issues with you. So if there's time and if there are desires, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Bhatia. We have time for at least one question.
Okay. The first question I have is, should Ansi also be involved in the UN ITU for 5G standards?
I think we should be involved in all development activities that are likely to create either harmonized, coherent solutions, or are likely to be a problem by creating diversive and complicated and intervening solutions. So every organization, especially a UN one, which has a scope of activity in the same area of activity that 5G activity in the, for example, WTO process or in the international ISO or IC processes going forward, should be considered as a very serious interest to get involved in.
Thank you. We have time for another one.
Okay. The second question I have is, Ansi used to own most of the Ansi approved standards, that is, carry Ansi and the SDO in the name. And now most have moved back to the originating standards organization. Why did this happen? Is it important to carry both designations when referring to the standard?
I don't think it's something that one can call a decision on in a given application. It's driven primarily by the standardization committee that creates the document and creates the acceptance of it through Ansi accreditation. They usually make the decision of what would be the best in that particular industry sector or in that particular application. Sometimes joint tags are appropriated. For example, we also have joint standards that are advanced internationally. We have a program in ISO where we have joint logos that are permitted in standards of US SDOs and those that are also co-written by ISO or IC. So I think it's the flexibility that is important, and depending on the market need and the market or user demand, it can be any solution.
Thank you. And I believe that is all the questions I have. Let me just check email. Yes, that's all the questions.
All right. Thank you again, Ms. Bhatia, for sharing your perspective on and providing an overview of Ansi and its role that it serves on collaboratives, which have been very impactful for DoD recently, and your perspective on China and competitiveness and how the U.S. engages in international standardization trade activities. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us today.